when we got that chaos energy, we gotta chat about some books. Hey pals, Alicia here. I hope you are doing well. And if you're new here, this is the place where we talk about books. Today, I'm here to do my November wrap-up. Chat about all the books that I read in the month of November. November was an awesome reading month for me. I read 9 books, I DNF'd 1 book, and for all of the 9 books that I did read, I loved them. They were like all 4 and 5 stars. There was 1 3-star book. No books that I hated other than the book that I DNF'd. I participated in the Indigathon this month, which is a month-long readathon hosted by Michelle at Thor Wants Another Letter and Brody at Et2Brody. Indigathon is awesome. It is a month-long readathon that is about reading books by Indigenous authors, and I was introduced to a ton of new books that I both read and then added to my TBR, so that is just amazing. So like normal, I'm going to chat about the books in order from lowest rating to highest rating, but this month it's all pretty samey because they're all pretty much on the high end. But without further ado, let's just dive in and chat about some books. So the first book we're gonna mention is the book that I DNF'd. And believe it or not, pals, it was Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. So if you've been here before on my channel, you will know that Snow Crash has been my white whale. It's been the book that's been on my TBR the longest. I've had this book on my shelf for probably 15 years. I've carried it from house to house, just not reading it and not sure why, because I thought I was going to love it. And my biggest problem with Snow Crash is that I hated it. But no, that's not fair. So I feel like I should have read Snow Crash when I picked it up these 15 years ago. And I think at that time, I probably would have loved it. But now as a person in their 30s, I read Snow Crash and it felt really just not something for me. Actually reading it, I felt like I was feeling somebody else's nostalgia for this story and I just could not relate. It's like that thing where there's like a classic movie that you missed out on watching when you were a kid and it was really popular, and then when you go back and watch it now, it doesn't hold up. So I felt that way about Snow Crash. It is not for me. It's never gonna be for me. And I got about 100 pages in, and I don't know, in like the first few chapters, there were a lot of things that really bothered me. There was lots of sexist language. There was this bigoted tone throughout. And I don't know, hero protagonist, the main character in this, it felt like a bit of like nerd fantasy, which isn't a bad thing. I feel like I've seen that trope done so many times that I knew what I was getting myself into as soon as I started this, and I wasn't vibing with it. I have read better cyberpunk and it's not for me, pals. So I'm finally gonna break up with Snow Crash. I also feel extra bad about this because I dragged Bert from Past Story Time into a buddy read with me for this, and then like within a day I was like, nah, sorry pal, I can't do it. So I am truly sorry, Bert, and hopefully next time I will pick a better book. So now we're getting into the 9 books that I did read in November, and I really enjoyed them all. So first up, we've got Little Heaven by Nick Cutter, and this is a horror novel. This is my 3rd novel by Nick Cutter. I have previously read The Troop and The Deep, and Little Heaven was one of my 5-star prediction books. I thought I was going to give this 5 stars. Just the absolute vibe of this 100% seemed like something I was going to love. And while I did enjoy Little Heaven, this is like a 500-page tome, and I can't discredit that it felt like a 500-page tome when I was reading it. So in Little Heaven, we are set in dual timeline in the 60s and then also in the 80s. And we are set in America. We are following a group of 3 mercenaries, and the 3 of them get brought together begrudgingly and hired by this woman to go to a small settlement aka a cult called Little Heaven in a very remote area in New Mexico because her nephew is there and she is worried about him. So these three mercenaries, along with this woman, go to this cult in New Mexico to see what's going on. So that sounds amazing. And with that premise, that is what you get in Little Heaven. And we got some serious cult vibes. We've got some serious body horror and like grotesque, like almost supernatural gore going on. Nick Cutter definitely delivers in that realm, though. So like all of those things are great and I enjoyed all of those things. But yeah, this novel felt long. It felt like the 500 pages that it was. And there was like a bit in the middle where I'm like, okay, I see where we're going. Let's just get there. Come on, Nick. Let's just get where we're going. So this wasn't my favorite Nick Cutter, but I do not regret reading it. I did enjoy it. There was one thing about this that did kind of disrupt my reading experience, and that was like just generally the way Nick Cutter wrote this. He had this kind of like, there wasn't a narrator, but he wrote it as if there was, if that makes sense. The like tone of the non-dialogue text felt like he kept making these like jokes and like jibes and like, I don't know, adding humor into it, which is like not necessarily a bad thing, but it just kept taking me right out of the story. I'm not sure if that's making sense at all, but just like the way he wrote this had a style that I hadn't read from him before that wasn't bad, but it kept taking me out of the story. So maybe that makes absolutely no sense, but that was one thing that I noted. I gave Little Heaven 3 stars. Would love to read more from him in the future, but unfortunately this wasn't my new favorite Nick Cutter. Next up, we've got Wild Seed by Octavia E. Butler. I read this for the Octavia Butler slow read along. I actually just finished this last night and I'm still stewing about it. I'm still thinking about this. Wild Seed is the first in a series. It's the first in the Patternist series. It was published in 1980, I believe. And I think it was marketed as a fantasy, but it felt much more like a science fiction. And in Wild Seed, we are following these 2 individuals. They are both almost godlike in their abilities. I think Josh on Josh's Bookish Voyage compared this to the X-Men, and that is like the perfect comparison in my mind, because we are following these 2 characters. They both are immortals. One of them is more of a healer, so she can heal herself and she can heal others around her in order to live forever and kind of maintain the longevity of people around her. Whereas this other character, he is also an immortal, but the way that he lives forever is that he is essentially a parasite who steals other people's bodies and their life. So he is jumping from body to body to body for millennia in order to live forever. And these 2 characters become intermingled across generations, across centuries, and the kind of exploration of character and development between these 2 individuals is explored in this. So this novel explores themes of power dynamics, both between man and woman, both between white and black, both between the master and slave dynamic. This has a lot of conversations about eugenics, which I was not expecting from this, but there we have it. This novel is essentially about eugenics. And yeah, I'm still thinking about this and I can't stop thinking about this. This was so well done and so complicated, and there was so much in this that made me go like, oh, I hate that happened, but also like I don't think it should have happened any other way, you know? Like this isn't like a perfectly wrapped up story, and it's not all neat with a bow. It's very complex and it's very complicated, and there's lots of things that you're just like, I hate that happened, but like I totally understand why that happened. And I am very curious to continue on in the series, for sure. I gave this 4 stars. Next up, we've got Love After the End, an anthology of two-spirit and indigiqueer speculative fiction. This is a short story collection that was edited by Joshua Whitehead. It was published this year in 2020. I think it just came out in October. And this was amazing. This was an awesome short story collection. I read this for the Indigathon read-a-thon, but I think I would have read it regardless. This has been kind of on my radar for a while after having read Johnny Appleseed earlier this year. And this anthology collection, it is written by a whole bunch of different Indigenous authors, and this is like a perfect intersection of like Indigenous fiction exploring indigeneity, but then also queerness. And this collection also is really interesting because in Joshua Whitehead's foreword, he said that when they originally had the idea for this collection, it was meant to be around, it was meant to be around like speculative fiction dystopians, but then they decided to pivot the narratives more in a utopian direction. And he says here, for as we know, we have already survived the apocalypse. This right here, right now, is a dystopian present. What better way to imagine survivability than to think about how we may flourish into being joyously animated rather than merely alive? And I thought that was awesome. I don't normally read the introductions and forewords before diving into a collection because sometimes they have plot spoilers, but I felt like that was a perfect way to introduce the stories because they were all very familiar stories in terms of things that have happened in the history all across Turtle Island, North America, but then had this very like hopeful spin on it. The majority of these stories had a spin in a hopeful direction, which was just really wonderful to read. So yeah, lots of queer stories, lots of kind of like space themed, space exploration stories. There was lots of stories that felt very familiar. There's one that's just like resonating so deeply. And I think it was very early on in this collection, and it was about how Earth was at this point of no return. We had used all of Earth's resources, and now it was no longer hospitable for humans. So humans were going to go populate a new planet that we had found. But when we get there, there's no humans on this planet, but there is a living being. There's like a living race that are like sea creatures on this planet, and it's very much paralleling colonialism of Earth essentially on this new planet and what that means. Like, it's just history. Is it just history repeating itself? What's going on here? So these are definitely stories that will make you think. There's a lot of like, it's speculative fiction, so every story you're kind of sitting at the end like, oh my gosh. There's lots of stories that will make you quite emotional. But again, it felt really refreshing to read speculative fiction that did have a kind of hopeful and joyous twist in a lot of the narratives. It just felt so powerful, so profound, so important, so now, and I love this and I highly recommend this. I gave this 4 stars and would read anything by any of these authors again. Next up, we've got The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This is a collection of 2 essays that were published originally in 1962 or 1963, and this was my one contribution to Nonfiction November. This is the one nonfiction that I read this month, and I am so glad I picked this one. This was amazing. This was 2 essays. The short one was a letter from James Baldwin to his nephew that's just kind of talking about what it means to be a Black youth or a Black man in America. And then the longer one was more of a musing on religion and then the role it plays in race and like the race dynamic and like the race war in America. And I feel like this, like the hype of this is so real because this still felt so relevant and this still felt so prescient and important even for today in 2020, which is like kind of heartbreaking, but also just so absolutely true. This was so much more emotional than I was expecting it to be. Yeah, for some reason when I just think of essays, I'm just thinking of kind of like dry facts being thrown at me, but this was so personal and so powerful and just a really incredible collection of essays. I kind of feel like this is required reading, especially now if you haven't read this already, and I am really here for James Baldwin's voice. I would like to go check out some of his fiction now because I loved his writing style, and I'm just really glad I read this and would love to check out more from him in the future. Next up, we've got Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. This was published in 2016 and is my third read by Stephen Graham Jones, and I absolutely loved this. Mongrels is part family drama, it's part coming of age story. It's got a little bit of horror, a little bit of slasher in it, but it read much more as a coming of age family drama. And in this, we are following a family. We are following a boy and his aunt and uncle, and they are a kind of makeshift family thrown together, and they are all werewolves. So it's exploring this family dynamic of werewolves in America, and the reading experience of this was so interesting. This story was told in a way that I don't even really know how to describe the narrative flow. It wasn't like a linear narrative where we start at A and we get to B, but it was also more than like a collection of interconnected short stories. Each chapter is just kind of an experience that the family has had together. So it's not necessarily in a linear order, but we are getting like a really well-rounded, fleshed out like exposure to this family. It was beautiful, it was heartbreaking. Some parts were very exciting and just very much like, there's a werewolf coming in through this wall right now. But then other ones were much more tender and quiet as we explored each of these characters who were all very well fleshed out. This is probably one of the best like werewolf narratives I have ever read, because it is so much more about the lore and like the lineage and the heritage of these werewolves rather than just the action right now. We learn so much about how the families and the family line works. I feel like this asks so many questions, like what about this about werewolves? What about that? And then he explores them in such an interesting way. So I absolutely love this. Definitely recommend this. I could see how some people might get a little bit frustrated with that like non-linear narrative, but that to me just added to the reading experience. It was unlike anything I had ever read before, and I loved it. I gave this 4 stars. Still loving my Stephen Graham Jones. Next up, I've got a horror novella. I read Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. This is a 2020 release, and holy dang, this is the most depressing novella I think I have ever read. Like this, just like from page 1, just had my heart ripped out, and then just like kind of showed it to me and like squeezed it at me and like threw it at me the whole time I was reading this. Like this is truly torturous in terms of how upsetting it is. So in Crossroads, we are following a woman. She is a single mother and she has an adult son. I think he's around 23 when he gets into a car accident where he very tragically dies. So it's a single mother. Her adult son has passed away, and this is now one year, coming up on the 1-year anniversary of his death. So yeah, so this explores death of a child, death of an adult child, and just kind of the emotional, psychological repercussions that would have on this individual. alone. This is incredible horror in the way that it blends supernatural and psychological horror. There is a lot of emotion packed into this like short 120-ish pages. Yeah, this pretty much blew me away, but I did not enjoy one single bit of it, you know? Like I read it so fast. I breezed through it. I had to absolutely know what was happening, but it made me feel like shit. So I would recommend it, and I will read more from her in the future, but just know this is heinously sad. Next up, we've got Annie Muktuk and Other Stories by Norma Dunning. This is a collection of short stories. This is actually a collection of interconnected short stories that are all about Inuk culture and kind of challenging perceptions of what being Inuit means to the rest of the world. This was an incredible voice, an incredible writing style. I was absolutely absorbed in this collection when I was reading it. Normally when I'm reading short story collections, I kind of pick up one or two a day as I go along, but I could not stop reading this, especially because not all of the stories were interconnected, but some of them were. So it was like this really exciting reading experience where one would just feel very standalone, and then the next two or three would be interconnected in some very like subtle and interesting way. Some of these stories were very haunting and horrifying, and it explored themes of like the trauma of colonialism in Canada has done to Indigenous people. But then some of them were very powerful stories centering very like strong characters. The character of Annie Muktuk shows up in a few of the stories, and she was just such a compelling character. And you get to learn Annie Muktuk from not from her point of view, but then also other perspectives. She's like very well-rounded in this collection. If you like short story collections, 100% recommend. These are contemporary stories, and then they also have a very like poetic voice. So if you really like poetry, read Annie Muktuk. If you really like short stories, read Annie Muktuk. If you want to learn more about Inuk culture, read Annie Muktuk. I love this. I heard about this book originally on Thunderbird Woman Reads, and I am not disappointed. I'm now going to read every single book that Danny recommends, because this was incredible and I am very excited to have this on my shelf. I gave this 4 stars and will definitely read more from Norma Dunning in the future. Now we're getting into my 5-star books. I read 2 5-star books in November. Absolutely 10 out of 10. 100% loved these stories. The first one up is Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. This is just, I feel like, one of the most important narratives I have ever read. I was so profoundly moved by Indian Horse. It was just an incredible reading experience with an incredibly generous writing style. And this is quite devastating, but it also has like this edge of healing and moving forward and next steps. So in Indian Horse, we are following an Ojibwe man named Saul Indian Horse, and it is set in the 60s. And Saul was a child that was stolen from his parents and brought to a residential school. He was raised in the residential school system along with his siblings and many other children from his community. And the residential school system is an absolutely horrible, heinous, tragic part of Canadian history. That stripped Indigenous children of their culture, of their language, of their basic human rights. Many children did not survive this system, and some of them that did were so traumatized by it that, I don't know if healing will ever be entirely successful. It was just an absolutely horrible piece of Canadian history. And Saul Indian Horse is in this school, and while he is there, he finds the sport of hockey, and he is so good at it. He is so gifted at it. And this kind of explores his life's path through hockey, finding himself, finding his way of existing and coping with his life through hockey, and just where that goes from there. So I don't want to say anything more without kind of spoiling the trajectory of this novel, but I just read it. This is so good. There is so much in it that will just continuously slap you in the face. It is so packed with emotion, with feeling, with just horrible things, but then also wonderful things. This is definitely a tale of Indigenous resilience, Indigenous healing, in spite of just like the Canadian system trying so hard to destroy that in an individual and a culture. I just absolutely loved this. I think you should read it. I gave this 5 stars. And finally, the last book that I have to share with you today is actually the first book that I read in November, and that is Elatsoe by Darcy Little Badger. I read this as a buddy read with Pixie with Pens, and this was just an incredible reading experience. I don't normally read YA because I'm kind of wary of a lot of the tropes that are in YA, but Elatsoe felt so new and it felt so different, and it didn't fall into any of the like kind of standard YA tropes. It was just such an incredible reading experience. In Elatsoe, we are following a teenage girl named Elatsoe, and she has an ability that is kind of passed down to her from generation to be able to communicate with the ghosts of dead animals. It's just a special ability that she has. And throughout, she is hanging out with her ghost dog named Kirby, who is her special ghost dog pal. And in this narrative, it's a bit of like a mystery detective story where Elatsoe's cousin has died, and Elatsoe believes that he was murdered, but the rest of the world has kind of chalked his death up as an accident. So she's on the hunt to figure out what's going on. So within this story, we are set in America. We are set in an America that you would recognize today, but it also is a world that has magic, and it has monsters, and it has just like creatures weaved within it as if it's like normal. That's just like a layer that's added on top of the America. And I love that kind of fantasy where it feels familiar, but it's also very different. It just felt so magical. There are your common monster beasts in here. There's werewolves in here. There's vampires in here. I love this. I loved learning a lot about like Lipan Apache culture. Darcy Little Badger is Lipan Apache, and that is very much weaved into here. This just was such a good story. It was so exciting. I felt like I learned a lot. I felt like it was so well written. My heart was just like beating so fast the whole time I was reading this. I just loved this reading experience. This was just a joy to read, and I loved it. So there you have it, pals. Those are the 9 books that I read in November. Again, a great reading month. Let me know if you read any of these books and what you thought. Let me know if you want to read any of them, and we can chat about it. So thanks again for being here, pals. I absolutely love talking books with you all. So take care out there. Stay safe. Stay spooky. And until next time, see you, pals!